Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you. And welcome to all. It's time for our annual get-together, the Bretton Woods Committee and the Council. And we're all looking forward to a productive half-day. It'll feel like more than a half-day, but I'm sure we'll all make it. It's a great program. I think we'll be very pleased to go through all of it. I was wondering what I should, normally, someone would get up and say, mind your cell phones, be kind to your neighbors, and go through all of that stuff and remind you where the bathrooms are and so forth. I'm not going to do that today. This is serious. Today, we're in the year 2017. Things are happening. It's always time to look back a bit at history. And we in the Bretton Woods, all of us here who are involved with Bretton Woods, think once in a while of what it's all about, where it came from. And I'd like to open this session with quoting from Paul Volcker. The quote is in your book. It's on the second page. I'll read it out again. Bretton Woods is not a particular institution. It is an idea, a symbol of the never-ending need for sovereign nations to work together to support open markets in goods, in services, and in finance, all in the interest of a stable, growing, and peaceful world economy. That's well said. Paul is good at that. And I also should mention that Paul, for many years, was a co-chairman of this Bretton Woods Committee. So when we look back to when it all started, in the middle of the last century, in the 40s, the Bretton Woods Conference, the guys who got together, what had preceded that conference is remarkable. There were two disastrous world global wars that killed and crippled millions of people around the globe. Two of them. And in between those two disasters, there was another great disaster, an economic and otherwise horrible disaster, and that is the Great Depression, which affected everybody in the world. By the time the Bretton Woods Conference got together up in New Hampshire, I guess the leaders, at that time it was the leaders of the free world, but it developed, as you know, into covering the entire globe, decided enough was enough. We had to do something. They had to do something to look forward with some reliance for a better world. So they developed what was known then as the Bretton Woods system, not then developed into that, and institutionalized it with the two principal institutions being the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But all of it was based on the principle of international cooperation. International cooperation. And basically it worked. It had its ups and downs, the system, as it developed. In the 70s, as you'll recall, those of an older age, the U.S. abandoned the gold standard and the dollar, and our Secretary of the Treasury said to the world, well, it's our dollar, but it's your problem. You remember that, Connolly. We recovered from that, and one of the reasons we recovered that the world was in great turmoil after that, to adjust to what happened in the Smithsonian Institution meetings. You will recall we had the petrodollar crisis and we had the Latin American debt crisis as well. So I think basically, apart from that blip, the basic principles, the basic institutions, and I might say that there was some thought that maybe since the Smithsonian, there was no longer any need for the institutions. And that, in fact, led to the establishment of this committee, the Bretton Woods Committee, in the early 80s, to develop a constituency within the U.S. for the IMF and for the World Bank. But apart from that, the system worked. And it worked well in terms of developing and maintaining international cooperation. So for us today, we who are interested in this subject, the name of this get-together, the annual, is Solutions for Sustaining Economic Cooperation. And that's something I think we have to really pay attention to. It isn't something we take for granted. It's something we have to prove. We have to prove works well for the benefit of all people around the globe. It needs continuing improvement. There's no doubt about that. But we have to keep working. Our first session will be manned by three leading individuals involved in the Bretton Woods institutions. Excuse me, I didn't pay attention to my own. I'm terrible. And among, I'm not going to get into, I personally will not get into great introductions of all our distinguished speakers. That'll be up to the moderators and so forth. But the three, we have a representative of the bank in Joaquim Levy. We have these are leaders of the bank and the fund, with Maurice Obstfeld and a fellow named as Jim Wolfensohn. I'm not going to introduce anything about Jim or any of them, but I would note the two things I know. During the 10 years, in my observation, during the 10 years that Jim was president of the World Bank, were milestone years, and a lot was accomplished, a lot moved forward. It spread its benefits around the world. It truly became a global institution that serves all the people of the world. And I also have to note, while I asked Jim and his friends to come up to the podium, that he has been a co-chair of the Bretton Woods Committee for many years before. And with that, if I could please, would you rise and thank you all and say thanks to Jim and the crew.
I'm going to sit here. Oh, thank you. Why don't you sit here?
First come, first served.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. The two of us are starting this program, But our third speaker apparently is not interested in anything we're going to say, and he'll come along and give us the truth from the point of view of the World Bank, since he disregards the IMF, as he should, and he disregards former presidents of the World Bank. But he will be here any moment, I'm told, and we can welcome him. He's going to come into a situation where my colleague and I can introduce the very stable situation in the world, the very positive outlook that all of us can have about the economics and the political future, about the strength of our country under the leadership of our president, where we have a very clear, and here he comes. We have our second speaker. Great to see you. Come on in.
Flash. I got on the back. Hey, hello.
That saves me filling in time. And you're very lucky you can now get to the real speakers. The purpose of your being here was to hear from our two speakers today, a very distinguished representative of the fund, who himself has a distinguished academic career, as you can read, with quite a number of universities under his belt, and a period also in government. And secondly, we have a speaker now from the World Bank, who had a period in government as a minister in Brazil, and a very distinguished career before that. So we have exactly what we need, two very good speakers to address a simple subject, which is the outlook and opportunities for an integrated global economy. They have an hour to deal with this subject, and we have a chance to have some questions from all of you. I think we should get started right away. We'll have our first speaker, Maurice Obstfeld, who, as you know, is the economic counsellor to the IMF. You can read his resume in the beautiful document which you have, but he's a first-class man, and I'd ask you to speak, if you would.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and I just want to acknowledge all the great work this organization does. Nope. You all, everyone hearing me in the back?
Can you raise the volume?
The
somebody?
volume. It's better.
Okay,
Good?
Yeah.
Back there? Okay. I first of all, before even talking about the global economy, want to acknowledge the great work that you all do. Bretton Woods stands for International Cooperation, and there's so many challenges in the world today. Challenges that, in fact, were not really even thought about back in 1944 when the blueprint was devised. These range from financial stability to climate change, to famines, to infectious diseases, all sorts of areas. And the fund has a financial remit, but the bank is very much involved in a lot of this stuff on the ground. And your support for this multilateral engagement is absolutely critical. Let me talk a little bit about the world economy. It's interesting for me to read the headlines about our messages because they get interpreted in all kinds of ways. Yes, we are optimistic about the short-term situation. We have concerns and indeed advice about the longer-term prospects. And these fit together because the short-term, the optimism, the lift we're seeing in the global economy provides an opportunity for action. For us, the worst thing would be for policymakers to look out the window, say things are good, markets are booming, we don't have to do anything. In fact, there are dangers down the road, and now is the time to increase resilience, to take actions that can support growth further into the future. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean about that. I don't want to hog too much time, so let me just cut to the chase. The world economy is experiencing the broadest upswing since the start of the decade, when the world came out of the sharp recession of the global financial crisis. We see surprising strength and indeed increasing strength in Europe, in Japan, where growth has been very weak, in East Asia generally, including China. In Europe includes Eastern Europe. It's a very broad, good picture. Canada is included as well. For the U.S., growth is above trend by a healthy amount, and we've raised our forecast from our interim forecast last July. So all in all, this is a pretty strong picture. Why do we have reservations? Well, one reason is that it's not universal. There are spots in the developed world where we see some slowdown. There are not many of those. The UK would be one, as Brexit starts to sink in. Latin America is having slow growth for a number of reasons, and I'm sure Joaquim will touch on that. But in general, commodity exporters are struggling. Many small states are struggling, and there's actually a substantial share of countries that are having a negative per capita output growth this year, which is somewhat shocking. But broadly speaking, if you look across the world economy, countries producing about 75% of the world's output are experiencing an upswing. So the unevenness is one point. Now you can say, why do you say the glass is 25% empty? I'm not really saying that, but you know, what happens in some of these countries can spill over, and we do have to look at the global situation. Within countries, growth has been very unevenly distributed, and that is another way in which we see fragility. The New World Economic Outlook has a chapter on wage growth in advanced economies. Wage gains have been very tepid as the world economy nears full employment. And in fact, over decades, median real wages have not risen much. Incomes have risen at the top. That's where the gains from growth have gone. And this is resulting in some social tensions in advanced economies. So we worry about that. And then we worry about the durability, the sustainability of this growth. Our projections for advanced economies for fuel exporters show that growth will not return in per capita terms to the levels that were enjoyed before the financial crisis. And that's worrisome because particularly in advanced economies, but indeed everywhere, we have ambitions, things we would like to do. We would like to do infrastructure. We would like to invest in the middle class. Can't do those things without growth. So that is a concern. Fuel exporters need to diversify their economies. That requires investment. So there are a lot of challenges. These challenges pose risks. There are other risks. We worry about whether financial valuations are overstretched. We worry about growth of debt in this low interest rate environment. Things are not perfect. But these are also issues that can be addressed by policy. Structural reforms differ across economies in terms of their potential, but there are a lot of things countries can do. In the U.S., there can be more incentives for labor force participation, and that's true in many economies. In many emerging economies, there's a lot of room to improve the business climate, the investment climate. So now, when times are good, policymakers should do this. And our research at the fund shows that it's precisely when you're in an upswing that some of these reforms are easiest. We worry that the buffers from fiscal and monetary policy, which were available in 2008 aid are now not so available. It may be a time for countries to think about building up fiscal capacity because the next recession will eventually come. Then there's also the multilateral agenda. The very fact that recovery is broad means a lot of countries can participate in reforms, in fiscal actions that are mutually reinforcing. And our advice is trying to push them to do that. Let me stop there.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and the commentary, and we'd like to hear from you now, Joaquim.
Okay, well, thank you. I also like to thank you the work of the Bretton Woods Committee in support of our institutions, and definitely this is a crucial moment. I'm sure that you all are familiar with either replenishment last year, and we are now at discussions in Congress, so that Congress really approved in the budget the 3-year plan that would be about $3.3 billion first year, and now for 18 about $1 billion. And we have from now to December really when Congress will start to make their decisions. But your validation, your support in the past has always proved to be one of the most effective movements in relation to our institution. So I like to thank you about the very consistent support you always get, and update you on what is on the plate and what you have to address in the next few months. Well, that said, I'd say that it's a very exciting time, of course, for the bank. We are happy when you see exactly the world economy having some recovery, although it's very uneven, especially when you look at the emerging markets. There are many regions, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, among others, where actually, if you look at the per capita income, there is stagnated. And even in 18, when you also expect on average to see continuous growth, still many countries will have that. Of course, China is helping with the growth. It's helping support commodity prices, who have been increasing, and this has spread the impact of global growth. And you actually do see some export companies like Nigeria, Brazil, that have been for many years in actually a contractionary mode, now stabilizing and increasing, still less than 1%. We project about 0.6%, in some cases 1%, but certainly they are turning the corner. We also see that, of course, general financial conditions continue to be extremely supportive. So we watch very much these economies, because in many countries, and actually I think even for some developed countries, debts that today are manageable and not a source of major concern, while interest rates are low, could be much more challenging if you see, for whatever reason, an increase in interest rates. And for some emerging markets, this is certainly a concern. Of course, when you look, say, comparing 10 years ago, you'd say that debt increased just from, say, 48% of GDP to 53%, in contrast with some developed economies. But still, it can be challenged if you do see a change in financial conditions. And of course, our main, say, concern, but also where we see opportunities, that as you see that the commodity price decline will be persistent, we're not going to have the booms of the period just after the crisis before 2013. It means that many of these economies have to go to deep adjustments. And there, I think it really begs a number of questions in terms of structural reforms, opening And this becomes more challenging in an environment where there are questions about trade, about competition. Of course, there are also even geopolitical risks. So the World Bank is really engaged with these economies to see how we can support this transition. Also, under the light of two major factors. And I think you did a wonderful job in the Rio with respect to one of them, which is the change about the future of work and what it means, all the technological revolution, as well as climate issues. We do see, of course, there are all these things about the Caribbean, but this year we had very major natural events. You can say Mumbai, Bangladesh, Philippines. We had a drought in Africa that has been very serious. Fortunately, conditions were better than were anticipated just a few months ago, but still very, very harsh when you think our Northeast Africa. And in some cases, when it's, say, combined with the conflict, we have situations like Yemen. So these are all issues that we have to look when we see the globe as a whole. It's really part of our, say, mandate that we take the opportunity of a global economy going better to address some key issues in terms of development strategy of countries. And I think later we may talk a little bit about this, but this is why we are increasing our focus on education and effective education for countries. Because when you look at this new environment and when you think where this commodity export economy can find growth in the coming years in this new economy, education will be even more important than in the last 10 or 20 years. So that's why we're gearing up this. And I think, I mean, if you allow me, recently our president, Jim Kim, was talking about the World Bank and the role of the World Bank in thinking about what is essential for growth. And he was mentioning that until the mid-90s, many of you think that was just infrastructure, just hard things. And then the bank started to look at the other things, governance and the education, because ultimately these things do have an impact on how you organize your economy. And I think when you mentioned reforms, it's not just fiscal reforms. There are these other structural profound reforms that we can support through our loans that facilitate these. Not that we have forgot infrastructure. I think when we look at the imbalance between savings and investment opportunities, when you think we don't have a final explanation, but certainly lower demand for capital, one of the reasons why the return on capital is so low, the possibility of channeling in a productive way part of this capital domestically as well as cross-border into productive, climate-smart infrastructure that you have an impact and the economic opportunity literally of billions of people, I think is a huge opportunity. And we are really focusing our work. And you understand that we are going to achieve that only with the help of the private sector. There is excess savings, even we see also in China. This is why they're doing OBOR and other things. They're reorienting their savings. But in the Western, when we see pension funds and we think about the need of strong income streams to support, say, retired, the baby boom generation, the opportunities in emerging markets and in particular infrastructure, if it's done in the correct way and with the private sector, I think are absolutely immense. And so I'd say these are really the three pillars that we've been focusing. Growth, and there include the infrastructure, the resilience, and everything that has to do with climate, natural disaster, the use of instruments like insurance to protect many, many countries on that. We have, this has proved effective in the recent season. And then human capital in all forms, because as these, the emerging market economies, especially the commodity exporters, have to restructure their economies, if they are not in the right position in terms of human capital, in terms of education, the prospect of growth and of development, sustained growth, become very much limited. So that's the way we see the world, and these are the three, let's say, vectors through which we really think we can help to address the challenge, but also the opportunities. I mean, I can conceive we thinking all these innovations and just worry about the downsides, or to have upsides if you work correctly.
Thank you very much for those two very stimulating interventions. Lead to a number of questions where we'll get many from the floor, but allow me to ask two, which are not unrelated. If I take your earlier intervention where you talked about coherent development in the world has changed a lot in the last 30 years since the turn of the century, where you had a small group of nations with very much of the global GDP, and that was true for decades in the last century. And since that time, you've had the emergence of powers that were relatively quiet before that, and now you have an international community where you have domination coming up from China and India, with the United States maybe number 3. And when we talk about the old G7, it's now intervened by new powers. How do you look at the future when you see this shift not only in the G7, but if you take the 30 top nations you have popping up through that top 30, very much changing positions in the views of China, India, Brazil, and other countries that are emerging. Brazil, because, of course, of the gentleman on your left who single-handedly brought them up. But could you comment on that?
Okay, so this one's for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to get him to comment too.
Okay. You know, we can say first of all that you know, it's become evident, particularly in the last 20 years, that for a number of countries the post-war development environment has been a great success. I mean, if you look at the number of people who have come out of poverty in the world, if you look at health outcomes in the world, I heard an amazing statistic yesterday from Angus Deaton, who is the Nobel laureate for development economics a couple of years ago, and he said that when he was born in Scotland in 1945, I think, average life expectancy was lower than it is in India now. So that's pretty remarkable number. And so there's no doubt there's been huge progress. Now that being said, not everyone is converging in the world. There are, as we look at, our growth forecasts for the years from now to 2022, we find that there are about, I think, 43 countries that will actually grow at per capita income growth rates below those of the advanced economies, who themselves are going to have lower per capita growth rates than in the past. So these are economies that are not doing well, that are diverging. Again, they're mainly fuel exporters, small states, a lot of work to do there. But for the bulk of the population in emerging and developing countries, there's no doubt there's been a huge success. And the fraction of the world economy that is in that's being produced, the fraction of output being produced by these countries is in purchasing power parity terms, more than half. So this is really big and very different from what the picture looked like, say, in 1980, just before the big debt crisis. A number of countries, with China being the leading example, have grown, although there are still some pursuing this. Vietnam grew with an export-led growth model, which worked for a while, and it worked fairly well when they were smaller. But now that they're big, it's just not as viable. And furthermore, we've learned that there were some pretty severe disruptive effects in a number of advanced economies, particularly the United States. And at some level, we're reaping the whirlwind now in a number of countries where we see a backlash against trade. So that model seems to be, for a number of reasons, no longer viable. It's also problematic in the sense that, manufacturing, relentlessly becomes more productive. And that means that relentlessly you need fewer people to produce the same amount of stuff. And this gets to the future of work issue. So if you're a developing country and you want to develop on the basis of manufacturing, well, is that really a viable place to employ all your workers? I think it becomes increasingly less so. Plus, the trade environment may be inhospitable. So there are concerns that the old model won't work, that some countries may not be able to, they may have premature deindustrialization. They'll have to move to services which are less productive more quickly before they've really attained middle or lower high income status. So what Korea has done, what Singapore has done, that may be much harder to do in the future. Aging is another issue. We've looked at Asian economies and we worry that for a number of them, the demographic dividend may be getting out of reach, may be gone. We say they may grow old before they grow rich. So I think it's a challenging time for thinking about development issues. A lot of progress, but will we see full convergence, more convergence? For some countries, yes, but for many others, not clear. But let me see what.
Well,
yeah, I think that I agree. Of course, this may require some sort of maybe international coordination, and because the risks that you get in say, feeding loops, you mentioned the question of low demand, and then you have low investments. So there are no easy answers, but there's no reason why you think, well, these countries will age before getting rich, and there is absolutely nothing to do. I think that with the promise, we have a large amount of capital. This capital will be necessary that they produce returns to sustain the advanced societies too. I think in some cases, perhaps you will still underestimate the impact of aging in the ability of growth. I think one of the reasons certainly that you see that advanced economies do not grow as fast as before the financial crisis is also related at ages. The impact even of some reforms may be very different. I think that if you look, for instance, the United States today and the United States in the 80s, it's not clear at all that if you do exactly what you did in the early 80s, you would have the same results, because the labor force is just not there, and the response of the labor force to its stimulus may not be there. So I think in a sense, also taking opportunities of different demographics, it's one of the let's say, the roles of trade, and not only trades of goods, but let's put trades of capital, which mean capital flows and investments. And I think that, of course, there are in some areas disappointments because of the results of trades. to a large extent, we could say that this is more a question of how the gains from trades were distributed than necessarily that there are no gains of trades. And this has to do with domestic policies that I think happen in every country. There are also developing countries where the gains of trade are not fairly distributed, and in some cases of commodity countries, you see the same. But when you look forward, what you do see is that some of the economies that were mentioned, I mean, India is really transforming itself in an incredible pace. When you think just the combination of the change in their payment system, and which was possible in part also because of the early change in their identification, the fact that people now were in condition to rely much less in money and in currency, together with the changes in taxation and some willingness of the government to address also old-fashioned problems like non-performing loans, so that they bring their banking system to a good shape. I think the potential is really big. Of course, as was mentioned, and I think it's a very important insight, some of these countries have become so big that they are now like some developed countries that have to live from their own domestic demand. They cannot count. When you're the size of China, of course, you cannot be forever that the main source of your growth will be external demand. And of course, this requires some re-engineering, and I think that they're doing that. There's a clear awareness of the authorities there. So I think one of the main changes is that we see some of these countries that have grown largely based on external demand is still having to count on trade, because any country, I mean, Europe counts on trade, but understanding more and more that ultimately their medium-term and long-term growth has to come from their domestic demand. And this requires some policies change, some restructuring, and even of some institutions. But it does happen in one day, so it's what we've seen.
I would love to just continue the analysis with you, but I'd like to get the audience to ask questions of our two speakers. I would have gone on to say that by 2050, Africa will have 25% of the world's population. By the end of the century, it'll be maybe 34, 35%. And that today, the center of global economy is probably Asia, in terms of China and India, less from other countries. But if not the center, it may be 40% of global GDP. These are very different things for the next generation of leaders to be thinking about. And it's quite different. Even from Latin America, you'll stay at 7 or 8%, I guess, of global GDP if I'm properly informed, but you're not going to see a huge jump there. Those are some things that I think underlie some of the questions we'd like to get into. But the audience may be more intelligent and have questions to ask. And so may I ask if there are any questions in the audience? There's a gentleman. I think it's a gentleman. Maybe it's a lady. I can't see.
There's one there too.
Well, I think I'm a gentleman, but I hope so. Try to be. Thank you very much for this really interesting program. And I wanted to just follow on the thing that you've been talking on a bit, but ask a specific question, which is there seems to be this dichotomy or divergence in sentiment between economies and markets on the one hand and geopolitics on the other. I mean, as we started the meeting, geopolitics is dying, I would use that word, if not a little bit worse. And yet the sentiment in markets, or the sentiment in geopolitics is dire. The sentiment in markets is not. Now, you've talked about some things where these elements may be changing in the future. But what happens when those sentiments converge, and how likely is that?
a question for me. Okay, that's one you should ask Mohammed later, but I'll take a stab at it. Like when I hear that question, it's kind of, I say, well, if we didn't have some of the geopolitical issues we're worrying about, would markets be even more buoyant than they are now? And I find it hard to answer that in the affirmative. So, one wonders if, the market, how much weight the market puts on these things. I don't think the market ignores these things, but they may be tempted to not put a lot of weight on them, to think that these are tail risks, that the world tomorrow is likely to be pretty much like the world today, and I think that's sort of the default for most people. Now, that means that if something happens that shocks that complacency, you could have an abrupt repricing in markets. Now, somewhat paradoxically, so I'm not saying that markets are totally ignoring tail risks, but somewhat paradoxically, I think the market's appreciation of risks, of some sorts of risks, might actually help to keep asset markets high. So let me explain what I mean. Starting in 2008, we saw a number of events that people just didn't think could happen. The global financial crisis, we thought that crises were an emerging market thing. They didn't happen in countries like the United States. They didn't happen in the Eurozone. Then we saw the Eurozone crisis. One way to read the world is to say that there's sort of radical uncertainty, that people actually think that a whole lot of things are possible. And if this is the case, it's going to have the effect of actually making people behave in a more precautionary way that can drive interest rates low. And one of the things we see in the world economy is a very, very low level of interest rates. Now, it's tempting to say that this is because of monetary policy, but I tend to view it more as monetary policy following a global real rate of interest that's determined by saving and investment behavior. And what we're seeing is kind of weak investment, more saving. So at some level, you might have these really low interest rates because people see the world as incredibly uncertain, and that actually supports the asset prices. So, the bottom line of this very complicated explanation is that, it's very hard to look at asset prices and say what markets are thinking, because there are some factors that might lead you to think, well, markets should be lower, but there are others that may actually support markets. And, we won't really know until something truly unexpected happens and we see how markets adjust.
Other questions? There's a gentleman down here.
You mentioned a couple of times human capital approaching levels of full employment, but we also talked about the technology problem and what the implications may be of that. A lot of the value going to the top end, a lot of potential problems, social and political, at the bottom end. Is basic income the answer? Is there an answer?
Could you
I'm sorry.
louder,
Did you hear my question? My question was about the impact of technology on future employment levels, social and political problems that might stem from that, and if you see a solution, political, economic solution to that.
Well, I think yes. I will give first a simple answer. Let's not forget it's true that in the old manufacturing you had a marginal contribution of workers, but I think it was not a pure calculation of marginal contribution that, for instance, led Henry Ford to say, well, let's pay my employees in a way that you create your own demand. So, and this is in a way translated even by new titans from the economy saying, well, is the solution, given that in some cases the marginal productivity could be thought being zero, just to give some sort of say, basic income. This might be a simplification of the approach, but I think captures an element that, yeah, you have to make some policy decisions in terms of the distribution of income if you want to sustain, say, you want to sustain demand. Okay, and this was, I mean, understood. It was a spark. And those who and Henry Ford, who invented understood that for the growth of his business, we need that. So I think in a way this has to evolve because it's a new condition comparing, say, with 20 years ago, and we don't have to rush to start programs quickly, but I think that we will have to explore this type of things. And this is why the World Bank is really, we have Paul Romer and others is really looking very deeply at how you can really model these things and get to a policy that we also understand the consequences.
I can't see, so there's a gentleman on the left, and then we'll go down.
Thank you very much. Very stimulating discussion and a little bit disturbing, I would say. The gentleman from the World Bank, Mr. Levy, Dr. Levy, started with reference to the replenishment of the IDA, which has been diminished at a time when the presentation of the IMF and others have suggested that the growth rates are actually now in a positive territory for both advanced industrialized countries and for many emerging market countries. The convergence issue was mentioned, and the linchpin there is refugee problems arising from inequality and other sort of political uncertainties. I wonder if you could actually try to address the issue of declining replenishments, declining support for multilateralism, including in the U.S., and the disparity between that and the growth outlook that you suggest, which seems that the replenishment should be higher, not lower.
Well, let me put a little bit perhaps on context. Actually, this replenishment has been a real, say, very strong in a way. In nominal terms, most countries that contributed in the United 17 kept the same level. Even if the proposal from the executive had was a small decrease, I think that the general sense is really to keep, particularly this current replenishment. The commitments were quite strong, and there was a novelty there that's very important, which is for the first time we are going to leverage IDA, which means that for every dollar in terms of contribution of donors, we're actually going to get $3 of impact in terms of programs. And IDA is absolutely crucial, I think, to address what Jim mentioned about Africa, one of the main targets. We plan at until recently, the total IDA packet was 45 billion. Now, just for Africa, you got 45 billion out of 75. And it's really, when you think about these demographics and the opportunity, because demographics also means labor force if you get the right ingredients. It's not easy sometimes, but that's the way it works. So I think that no doubt to have now the moments where some countries are translating the commitment into actual budget allocation is very important to see. In the short term, there are issues like I say, of course, refugees, instability in many regions, including around Europe. But if you look at the medium term, it's also, I think, very important because it's a way to use the difference in demographics actually for global advantage. And like I said, part of the work with IDA is not only that you count on the private sector to buy the bonds and through this way really leverage the contribution of governments, but also we introduce some new tools in IDA to develop the private sector in many of these countries, even those that are facing big challenges, in a way that we really move towards creating strong income streams in these countries and have an impact on the human capital there. So yeah, I think most countries have been extremely supportive. A number of emerging market countries, let's call this way, have stepped up their contributions. I mean, from Algeria to some countries in Latin America and in Asia, understood that this is really a common endeavor. So I think that we are in a moment that there is an opportunity to show the support and the returns, both in short term and in the longer term, are definitely extremely high.
There was someone in the middle there. There's an arm up.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My question is there any concern for lost investment? And we're talking about, for example, there is a big push to industrialize Africa, and we're talking about major infrastructure dollars, for example. And one of the results we're open to see in the future is the labor stimulant for the youth population, almost 900 million by 2030. And given that today industrialization to support manufacturing, for example, and we're hoping people will be employed, that we have robotics, more efficient technology, that those investments could be lost. What kind of consideration has been given to that? And have we considered pretty much how to perhaps invest in education in today's young population or future youths, not so much to be, I'm going to say, kind of industrial workers, but more R&D scientists? I don't know if that would be better use of our dollars, or some of our dollars.
Well, I think this is an excellent point. And actually, one of the things that we're doing in these annual meetings, our World Development Report, address education and not only say how much you spend, but how to get. So how you measure the learning outcome, this ability, if not to be, say, scientists, but we have a lot, say, developers of, say, applicatives and IT products in Africa. And I think that this is, I would say that the strategy for many countries in Africa is really to ensure your infrastructure, more than the site they're going to be manufacturing A, B, or C. It's really ensure, for instance, you have energy, because if you don't have energy, it's very difficult to do things. You have the adequate communication. You have also the adequate institution. I think that's, for instance, when you look at the G20, we have the compact with Africa. And really this is a commitment of the international community to work together to ensure that these things are accelerated with the help of the private sector, so that we create the underpinning, including in sectors like agriculture, that will be increasingly important to Africa, the underpinning of a growth that's enough flexible in a world of so many changes that you cannot really forecast in detail, but you have this ability to respond. And education is really what, say, endowed and enable a country to respond to different types of shocks.
Give me the last word.
The last word. Okay. You know, you, Jim, brought up Africa before, and Joaquim, you've just addressed that question, but there's a tendency for us in the rich countries of the West to I think, underplay the importance of Africa globally and systemically. And if you put together the population growth, the very young population, and how rapidly it's increasing, and some of the infrastructure problems. Joaquim, you mentioned energy, transport infrastructure is a big barrier, and one of the big things that I would want to stress, which grows out of our World Economic Outlook that you mentioned, thank you, is climate infrastructure. We looked in that chapter of the WEO at the effects of climate change, particularly on low-income countries. And Africa is incredibly exposed to the effects of climate change with potentially very large losses. We have already seen the effects of drought. The effects of temperature increase per se on economies are very strong. And so there also need to be investments in adaptation in these economies to protect them, because the cost of not acting could be massive migrations, which will have global spillovers. And it's very much in the interest of the global community to think about how to invest in Africa, to also think about mitigating emissions and making good on the Paris commitments, because Africa has huge potential, but there are also huge risks if some of the issues are not addressed.
Well, I'm afraid that we're out of time for the beginning of a very important subject, and I want for you to thank our two speakers for getting us started. And if you come back next week, we'll have a session of 3 or 4 days on this, and we'll ask our two speakers to lead us. But thank you very much for coming. Thanks a lot.
You want to go by here? Say that again. Say it loud.